it's gone seven o'clock, so we'll get started. We've got 32 people in. Oh, another couple coming in. But what I'll do, Lee, you got your hand up? Right, okay. It's gone seven o'clock, so we'll get started. We've got 32 people in. I don't need to have that going, do I? Couple coming in.
Is that going from another?
Yes, yeah, that's where it's streaming to.
Yeah.
So that's right. I've got rid of that.
That's why there's a delay.
Okay, Lee, you got your hand up, I see.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, lower your hand then. Okay, right. Okay, fine. So if I'll mute everybody for now, and then I'll just leave Mike to. You've dropped down the list, Mike. There you go.
Oh.
There you go. So if you want to say a few words before we get going, if everybody else can turn off their webcams, that would be great.
Okay.
Save a bit of bandwidth.
Yeah. Are we ready?
I think so. Yep.
Okay.
I'll make sure anybody else comes in, I can let them in.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much, David, for hosting this for us. Basically, I wanted to do this for Go Space Watch because last weekend should have been a lecture meeting with 4 lectures to honour the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13. But obviously now we've been in lockdown for 4 weeks or so. Obviously we couldn't hold that meeting. Hopefully that meeting's going to be resurrected later on in the year, or when we can actually all get back together again. What we do in Go Space Watch, we're putting together a series of meetings in the West Midlands to promote the space flight and astronomy, and also to produce a magazine called Capcom. Capcom's actually been going for the last almost 30 years or so, which was introduced as part of the Midland Spaceflight Society group back in the early days. I've actually edited the magazine for all of that time, with help from Dave Evitts, who does the proofreading for that. What the idea now is, although Midland Spaceflight Society is actually closing because things have changed along a lot since that was set up. The Spaceflight Society was set up long before the internet came into being as it is now, and a lot of people have access to spaceflight stuff on the internet now that Capcom was supplying in the early days. I'm going to take Capcom away from Midland Spaceflight Society, which is actually closing, and bring it into Go Space Watch, with the plans to further set up the magazine, get it a bit more user friendly, and with more of a wider appeal as well. And now, of course, with the internet, I'm hoping to get a lot more subscribers and hopefully send it around the world as well. So all the details of Capcom magazine are on our website, which is www.gospacewatch.co.uk. So with that, then, if anyone wants to ask any questions about the Go Space Watch later on, please do so. But for the moment, I'll hand back to Dave to give his presentation. Thank you, Dave.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay. Right, I'm pleased to be able to do this talk because I've put quite a bit of effort into doing it and thought I wasn't going to get to present it. So here we go. So I call it Saving Apollo 13. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. Of course, tonight was the 50th anniversary in about 12 minutes time, I believe, of the launch of Apollo 13. And of course, the Apollo missions all started really with the space race. And of course, the Russians, or the Soviets as they were then, were Sputnik to launch the first satellite. And then, of course, they launched the first man in April 1961. And then the Americans took a little bit of time to catch up. And when they launched Alan Shepard, he didn't actually go into orbit, but he did do a ballistic trajectory out into the Atlantic, and he went above the 62-mile limit. So he became the first American in space. But that was enough for the president at the time, JFK, to stand up in front of Congress to say these words.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Can everybody see the screen okay? Because someone's just said they can't see the screen. Can someone just type in the message for me? I can't make it. Is that on? Yeah, it's fine. Okay, so are you on a phone, Kath? That's fine. Okay, I'll carry on. And then, of course, that sort of started the gun, fired the gun to get the launches going. And then... Oh, well,
why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
And of course, that followed with the Mercury and the Gemini missions, and then onto the Apollo, where this enormous infrastructure had to be built. This crawler to carry the huge Saturn V rocket out to launch pad, and then the vertical assembly building, as it was then, to assemble the rocket. And when you compare it to the telecom tower in London, you just see just how big that building really is. And then, of course, it started with the disaster Apollo 1, just on the test on the launch pad, but no mission. They were just doing some test outs just to make sure everything was working, and there was a fire in the capsule. So we lost our first 3 astronauts in that fire, which set the Apollo mission back, and the command module had to be redesigned to make it a little bit safer. That was then followed by Apollo 7 in 1968, and there's the launch. I love that photo. So it wasn't the Saturn V, because they were going into Earth orbit, and they were just going to practice some of the rendezvous. And this is the front end of the 3rd stage, the S-IVB stage. And they didn't have a lunar module. It wasn't ready. So they had to practice moving up to the target and back without actually taking the lunar module out. So they had a bit of a problem at that stage, because when Apollo 8 was ready to launch, they still didn't have a lunar module. So what were they going to do? Launch them into Earth orbit and have a practice dummy run again? No, let's send them out to the moon. So these were the first people to break the bonds of Earth's gravity and wander out in orbit around the moon. And what a fantastic mission that was. And then, of course, that was followed up by Apollo 9. By this time, the lunar module was ready. And then they could test out the lunar module and the command module, practice rendezvous, docking, and everything else that was needed for the moon mission. So everything was on ready to go for the landing. So here they are, testing out the spacesuit as well to make sure that was okay. And then Apollo 10 followed, and they returned to the moon and did everything apart from land. That must have been so frustrating. So they went down to about 50,000 feet from the lunar surface before they came back again. And then re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, the Apollo 10 command module. I believe it still has the fastest re-entry speed. And you can view that down in the Science Museum in London. It's a sort of bit out of the way, really. It should be on proud display in the main gallery, the space gallery, but it's sort of down the side. But it is there and go down and see it because it's on loan from the Smithsonian Institution. And then the lunar module, Snoopy, that's actually still in a solar orbit, apparently. And there's a Folks Telescope Schools project to actually try and find it. I don't know how they've got on with that, so I haven't heard much about that lately. And then, of course, it all culminated with Apollo 11, the first attempt at a landing.
At the foot of the ladder, the LEM footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the LEM now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And who can forget that? If you was old enough to remember it, I do, and that's probably why I've got such a love of astronomy and spaceflight. And of course, these iconic pictures of Buzz on the surface of the moon, and the footprint of Buzz. It's not Neil Armstrong's footprint; it's actually Buzz's. And then the view of the Earth rising above the lunar surface as well as they came back. And of course, don't forget Michael Collins. Everybody forgets Michael Collins. So always make sure when I'm going to schools and I mention the Apollo missions, we always make sure that Mike Collins is remembered to the children. Okay, we're then followed with Apollo 12. So because Neil didn't quite make the landing he was meant to, they wanted to make sure they got a pinpoint landing. And by this time, Apollo 20 mission had already been cancelled, and 18 and 19 missions also looked like they would lose their funding as well. But they took off from the Cape quite nicely, but just after launch, it was actually struck by lightning. So it caused all sorts of problems. Just for a short while, but they carried on with the mission and they landed very close to Surveyor 3, which landed nearly 2 years previously, and brought back bits from it so they could see how it fared on the surface of the moon while it was there. And the third stage is actually still in a chaotic Earth orbit, and it could be visible to amateur astronomers around 2040. I hope I'm here because I'll have a go at that one. And I know that because the spectral analysis showed that it was the same as the titanium paint they used on the rocket. Oh, every time you click the other thing, it stops you from actually clicking the presentation. And there's a picture taken by an amateur some years ago when it went past the Earth at its brightest. So that'd be great fun to have a go at. And some people would have had Bepi Colombo this weekend, which went past. And there's the Apollo 13 crew. It was James Lovell, Jack Swigger, and Ken Mattingly. And of course, there was a problem with Ken Mattingly because he was exposed to rubella. And so they pulled him from the crew a few days before, and Fred Hayes stepped in to the crew. But the problems really started quite a while before launch. It was on the launch pad, and an oxygen tank had draining problems. But the only time they actually do that is on the launch pad. So they didn't think it was too much of a problem. So here's the oxygen tanks in the side of the command module, those two spherical tanks inside the service module. And the tank had been previously mishandled. It had taken out of another command module and reinstalled, and it had been mishandled at the time. So they think it might have been damaged inside. It also had a lower voltage design than was used. And so when it was actually put on the launch pad and some of the tests were done, it actually shorted out the valve inside, and the heater was stuck on, and they used the heater to actually adjust the pressure within the tank. And they reckon that the temperature in the oxygen tank gradually rose to about 1,000 degrees, but they didn't know because the dial only went up to 80 degrees. So it's a bit of a problem. And it burnt the insulation off the internal wiring. So there was a time bomb waiting to go off. but they launched without any problems. Well, not quite. The date was 11th of April 1970 and time was 1913. How are we doing for time? Oh, a few minutes late, never mind. But that was 1313 in Houston time. So a lot of people were saying, oh, is that a bad omen? Of course, one of the main engines shut down prematurely, but the other 4 engines carried on a bit longer to get the orbit it needed. And here's the Saturn V rocket, which is huge. The first stage has got these 5 F1 engines, only burn for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, use that much propellant, 7.5 million pounds of thrust, and they get the rocket up to about 6,500 miles per hour. The second stage uses that much propellant and gets the rocket up to about 15,000 miles per hour. You've also got the launch escape system at the top there, which would drag the command module away from the main rocket if there was a problem on launch. And then the third stage uses that much propellant and that fires 3 times. It gets it into Earth orbit and then corrects the orbit, and then it gets the rocket up to about 25,000 miles an hour, and that sends it towards the moon. Okay, so the problem with the rocket, but it was fine. It got them into Earth orbit and it got them towards the moon. Once they're on their way, here's the configuration. So the rest of the rocket has dropped away. And you're left with this part of the rocket going towards the moon. And so you can see the fairing comes off here and reveals the lunar module underneath. And then it's what they call a transposition, docking and extraction maneuver. So as they're heading towards the moon, traveling at that speed, the command and service module turns itself around and then it moves towards the lunar module very carefully and then docks with the lunar module, which is contained within the top of the third stage. Once it's safely docked and secured, it can then extract the lunar module away, and then the third stage is directed to go away from the command and service module and lunar module stack while they go towards the moon. And in most cases, the third stage impacts the moon, and in this case it did, and that was about the only thing that actually reached the moon on Apollo 13. So that part of the mission went as it should have done. Of course, problems built up. And getting there, it's a journey of 250,000 miles. And of course, it's not just a case of pointing at the moon and going, because the moon's traveling. They have to put the stack into a hyperbolic orbit. It takes it way past the moon and then back round to Earth again. So they go off in that sort of direction. But you've got to remember that the moon is moving as well. So that's moving over 2,000 miles an hour. And then Apollo has to race ahead of the moon. And by the time it gets to about 39,000 miles from the moon, it's slowed right down because of the gravitational force of the Earth is actually pulling on it. So it slows down to about 2,000 miles an hour. And then once it gets to the moon, it has to miss it by about 50 miles. It's a bit like running ahead of a steam train, really, and racing in front of it. But they miss it and then fire the engine to stop it, slow it down so it goes into orbit around the moon. And then while they're on their way, they had a broadcast. So they were broadcasting to the world, to the country, to tell them and take them on a tour of the spacecraft.
Okay, good evening, America, and welcome aboard Apollo 13.
The trouble is, by this time, we'd had 2 missions landed safely on the moon. Nobody was interested. None of the channels around America wanted to broadcast it. And I can remember having real trouble trying to find anything about the moon mission at the time. And if you turned on your TV in America, you were more likely to see something like this. That's enough. Okay, they did attempt to image Comet Bennett, but this was 31 hours into the mission, But then a little while later, people started to get interested in the mission. And it all started about 200,000 miles from the Earth. So we're already quite a way there, and about nearly 56 hours into the mission. And one of the guys in mission control, he asked them to stir one of the oxygen tanks. Hold on, let somebody in. And so he asked the Capcom to actually tell them to stir the tank.
Yeah, 55, 52. 13, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tank.
Okay, so stir up your cryo tanks, and that's when everything went wrong. That's when there was a loud bang and a shudder on the command service module, and data started to drop out at mission control. And that's what they thought it was, because they were having data problems up to that point, and they just thought it was data dropouts. But the crew were obviously having a different experience to those on the ground. But mission control were looking at what was happening and trying to work out what was going on.
Flight Commune. What's the matter with the data? Heater current looks normal. Okay. We got more than a problem.
Okay, listen, you guys. We've lost fuel cell 1 and 2 pressure.
We lost O2 tank 2 pressure. You can see, you want to look at it? And temperature. Houston, we've had a problem.
Okay.
Stand by, they got a problem. See a hardware. Roger, main B undervolt. For econ.
Negative flight.
O2 tank 2 pressure?
I believe the crew reported. We got a main B undervolt.
Okay, flight. We've got some instrumentation flights. Let me add them up.
Roger.
Okay, stand by at 13. We're looking at it.
Yeah, mission control thought it was just a problem with data, but of course, the problem was real. And about 15 minutes later, James Lovell was looking out the window and he could see they were actually venting something, and he relayed that back to mission control.
Yeah, that's good for AC, and it looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something.
Crew thinks they're venting.
Roger. Good flight.
Coming out into space.
Flight to econ.
Copy your venting.
Go ahead, Econ.
Let me know when that shows up.
Roger that. Well, we've already seen some of it.
Okay.
It's a gas transport.
So they're actually venting something into space. So it wasn't a data problem. It was something wrong with the spacecraft. And of course, we all heard the expression, Houston, we have a problem, but that's not what they said. That's not what Jim Lovell said. He said,
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
so there you can see, we've had a problem here. So it's one of the most misquoted comments in all time. And from Earth, they were using a 16-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain to actually monitor the trajectory of the spacecraft. So there you can see an image taken by them and actually recorded the cloud of oxygen that was building up around the spacecraft. And then, of course, once they knew there was a big problem, how do you get the crew back home safely? So lots of people in mission control trying to work out how to get them back and what they had to do to get there. So what were the problems? Well, both oxygen tanks were leaking. Because both oxygen tanks were linked together, as soon as one ruptured, the second one leaked as well. So all the oxygen was leaking from the service module. So that meant lack of breathing air. So there was not so much breathing air for them. And there was lack of power because that oxygen supplied fuel cells. And that was a lack of water. So how the fuel cells work is you get oxygen and you get hydrogen. And they were stored in cryogenic tanks. And when you combine those together, the waste product is water, and they supply electricity and heat. So electricity to power the spacecraft, water to cool some of the instrumentation and for the astronauts to drink, and then heat to keep the temperature in there quite nicely and keep some of the components at the right temperature as well. So that was failing and that was disappearing rapidly. So in effect, the command module, the service module was dying, and so was the command module, because the command module only had 2 hours of battery power in it. So how do you get them back home? Luckily, they hadn't landed on the moon, so they could use the lunar module, or the LEM, as a life raft. It had battery power, it had oxygen, and it had water, but it had just enough to keep 2 men alive for 2 days. But it needed to sustain 3 men for nearly 4 days to get the trip back to Earth. And the command module has only got about 2 hours of battery power left in it, because it was only used in the last couple of hours before they re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. So what are the options open to getting them home? Well, they could have turned the spacecraft around, and that was use the SPS, or the Service Propulsion System engine, which is the big one at the back of the service module here, and send them back to Earth. That's the most direct route to get them back there. But they didn't know whether they could use it or not, because the service module was dying, and so they didn't want to use that method. The other thing they have to do is think about the timing of the recovery, because you want them to come down where you've got a ship to recover them. So if you don't time it right, you come down either over land, or you come down where you don't want to, you haven't got a ship to recover the spacecraft. So you have to think very carefully about the best way to do that. But they couldn't use that engine because of the service module damage. And so what they decided to do was to use the LEM to bring them home. So here's the command module, the bit in the middle, the cone shape. This is where the crew spend most of their time. But of course, underneath here, you've got the heat shield, and that protects them when they come home, when they come into the atmosphere, absorbs all the heat of re-entry. The lunar module, of course, that was the bit that should have landed on the moon, but luckily they hadn't landed on the moon, so it was still available, and it still had resources that they could use. And then, of course, the service module here, that was dying, and that was dead because of the explosion or the rupture of the tank on the side. So what they had to do, as they were still in this configuration, they shut down the command module to save that 2 hours of battery power, and went into the lunar module, and then left only the essentials running in the lunar module. So it got really cold, and they had to endure a trip around the moon and then come all the way back again. So the lunar module was used. So instead of using this big engine at the back, the SPS engine, they were using the engine that should have landed them on the moon to actually make the trajectory changes, because they were going to land in the Frau Maro region of the moon. And so they weren't on a free return trajectory. So they had to change the orbit to get them back to Earth. Otherwise, they would have missed it if they didn't do anything. And so they used that to go all the way around the moon. And then used the lunar module to orientate themselves and fire the engine, and 79 hours into the mission, they then sent them back towards the Earth. And of course, yet another problem. As the crew were breathing, they were giving out carbon dioxide. Of course, remember, the lunar module was only meant to keep 2 men alive for a couple of days, and the lithium hydroxide canisters that were in there, this is one off the command module, which is square. The ones in the lunar module were round, and so they wouldn't fit from the command module into the lunar module. So they had to come up with a way of cobbling something together so they could use the square lithium hydroxide carbon dioxide scrubbing canister here, and included duct tape and a sock, but they managed to put something together so that they could use them. And then the carbon dioxide came out of the spacecraft atmosphere. And then 97 hours into the mission, they had another problem. As if they didn't have enough problems with power as it was, a battery popped on the LEM as well. So they lost even more power. So they had to really scrimp and scrape on the resources even more. Okay, so then they continued their journey. A final mid-course correction was required about 137 hours into the mission, And that had to be done before a helium tank disc ruptured due to overpressurization, which they knew would happen. So they had to time that just right before it actually burst. And they managed to do it. And that's the bit that's over dramatized in the Apollo 13 film, if you watch that. So eventually they did manage to get back to Earth. And then 138 hours into the mission, the service module separated from the stack. And then as it floated away from them, they could see that the whole side of the service module had completely ruptured and the whole panel had come off the side. So it's a good job they didn't actually use that engine. And then 141 hours into the mission, the lunar module was separated, and then the command module could come in for re-entry. And there's Aquarius, the lunar module, as it drifted away, and that would have just burnt up as it came in through the Earth's atmosphere. And then the command module came in for re-entry. And of course, the question was the heat shield damaged? So as they came in, if that had been damaged, then obviously it wouldn't survive re-entry. And then, of course, once they come in for re-entry, they can't communicate with the spacecraft because of the plasma around it.
The period of blackout for the spacecraft should have begun about 20 some odd seconds ago.
And so all this time they can't communicate with the crew, so they don't know whether they've survived re-entry or not. And then everybody's waiting for the come out of communications blackout to see whether or not they'd actually made re-entry successfully. And then, of course, was the parachute mechanism damaged with the explosion as well? So everybody waiting to hear from the crew as they came in order to see the command module. And they're about a minute and a half over when they should have come out of blackout. So that was a bit more tender hooks for people as they were waiting to hear from them as well.
Odyssey Houston, standing by for your Noun 67 when you get it, over.
So these are the drogue chutes opening to stabilize the capsule as it comes in. And this is USS Iwo Jima, which was the ship that was sent to recover the crew.
A report of 2 good drogues coming up now for main chutes.
And then, of course, they came through the clouds, 3 good chutes, and were speaking to the crew. They made it successfully back to Earth.
Splashdown at this time. On pickup, parity. Roger.
Another cheer in the control room as we had splashdown.
Photo 1, splashdown at this time. The 3 chutes are displaced or in the water.
So successfully splashed down 142 hours into the mission, and then they are being recovered by the helicopter crew. And then, of course, they arrive on the Iwo Jima less than an hour after splashdown. So it's absolutely fantastic recovery. So there they are arriving. And of course, those of you know, if you watch the Apollo 13 film, and there's Tom Hanks, Kevin Bacon, and the captain who meets them on the ship in the film is actually Jim Lovell himself, the commander of Apollo 13. And then, of course, Mission Control did an absolutely fantastic job getting those guys back. And, you know, failure wasn't an option with these guys, and they certainly bent over backwards to make sure that they got those crew back safely. And then just to add that there was a bill from Grumman Aerospace to North American Rockwell for $312,500 for recovering the command module by using the Lunar module. And I think they just went back and said that they'd been taking the Lunar module to the moon the last few missions, so they didn't owe them anything, but it was just a joke, really. Anyway. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for the live bit. And then